Now, there's another substack that I must read to you. Pay careful attention. It will mention that previous article as well. Now, this one is most recent. It's dated December 1st, 2025 by the same Dr. Maryanna Demasi, and it's called Cochrane Misled the Public on the HPV Vaccine. Cochrane declared, quote, clear and consistent evidence that the HPV vaccine prevents cervical cancer, but its own data tell a very different story. When Cochrane released 2 new reviews on the HPV vaccine last week, the message was delivered with unusual force. The organization, long regarded as a gold standard in evidence appraisal, announced that the vaccine provides, quote, strong and consistent evidence, end quote, of preventing cervical cancer. Its press statement went further. Cochrane claimed that girls vaccinated before age 16 were 80% less likely, and that's in quotation marks, 18% less likely to develop cervical cancer than their unvaccinated counterparts. Major news outlets and academics on social media repeated the figure, reinforcing the impression that the science was now settled. Lead author Dr. Nicholas Henschke declared that, quote, we now have clear and consistent evidence from around the world that HPV vaccination prevents cervical cancer, end of quote. Now, all of that is being said in December when we already learned from the Scottish study in October that made a similar claim that it was fake. Continuing, senior author Dr. Joe Morrison said the reviews, quote, make it clear, end quote, that vaccinating young adolescents, quote, can prevent cancer and save lives, end quote. While the confidence was absolute, the evidence was anything but. My analysis of the 2 reviews shows that Cochrane's headline claim relies on observational data that are inherently at high risk of bias, not the rigorous evidence suggested by its public messaging. What emerges is a widening gap between the sober conclusions inside the reviews and the sweeping claims made to the public. This is why I'm pausing here to say, this is why we need research. I have always been one who advocated that we do our own research, even in our countries, because we recognize that you cannot just take the information given to you by many of the health agencies, the World Health Organization, WHO, the PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, the CARPHA, Caribbean Public Health Agency. You just cannot take guidance from them like that. No matter how traditional it has been, you have to do your own research. Otherwise, you will find yourselves in problems following what they call the science, the established science, and then ending up in trouble like what we face in COVID-19. Pandemic. So let's look at some of the information concluded upon when Dr. Demasi did her reviews. Subheading, RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, did not show cancer prevention. The first of Cochrane's 2 reviews analyzed 60 randomized controlled trials, RCTs, which are normally the gold standard of reliable evidence. Here, the author's own conclusions were far more cautious. Quote, the studies were not of sufficient duration for cancers to develop, end quote. Did you hear that? So when you read the actual authors of the study, their conclusions, they say the studies were not of sufficient duration, length of time in other words, for cancers to develop. Yet you had all these headlines based on the studies saying, oh, we know for sure now that HPV vaccine stops cervical cancer. You see how they lie? You see how the media lies? Continuing, and you could see a photo of the study there. Human papillomavirus HPV vaccination for the prevention of cervical cancer and other HPV-related diseases in network meta-analysis. Cochrane Library published this. Continuing, this is not a minor caveat, that statement that says the studies were not of sufficient duration for cancers to develop. This is not a minor caveat. It is the crux of the issue. Cervical cancer develops decades after initial HPV infection, but vaccine trials tracked participants for only a few years. They did not follow participants long enough for cervical cancers to appear, and no trial reported cervical cancer outcomes. As a result, the trials could not show whether the vaccine prevents cancer. They measured only early cellular abnormalities, cervical dysplasia, CIN, changes that often resolve naturally and take many years to progress into cancer, if at all. Are you hearing this? This is what we had said for years in 2014, in 2017, when we did our advocacy here, educating parents and children and telling them not to take this vaccine. I'm talking about in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And of course, in the 2014, we had Brother Medina airing programs on television in Trinidad and Tobago about the dangers of the Gardasil vaccine. Over here, we had to deal with Cervarix, that's another brand of HPV vaccine. This is a point that we've been making all along, if you recall, that you don't have enough time to study these people because they're so young when you give them the vaccine, and then the cancer doesn't develop until much later in life. So if you tell me you do a study, you do trials now, you could never prove that they prevented cervical cancer in the person. That vaccine prevented it. You could never prove it until that 12-year-old turns 50 or that 13-year-old reaches to the age 50, thereabout. You can't prove it. Besides, the only thing that they found in these trials was certain cellular abnormalities, which are things that can resolve naturally in, I think, about 2 years. If you have an HPV infection, human papillomavirus, if you get infected with the virus, it clears your system with a strong immune system. It clears your system within about 2 years, a healthy immune system. And therefore, you don't have to worry about cancer. You don't have to think that an HPV infection is an automatic cervical cancer, diagnosis. You don't have to think it's sort of like a doom message that, cervical cancer. No, HPV infections can be cleared from the body within 2 years in a normally functioning immune system. As a matter of fact, we learn that HPV infections are not only received through sexual contact. You can get it from sharing a towel with someone. You can get it from sharing a kiss. It could be a child. It could be a baby, a child being kissed on the mouth by a mother or by an adult, right? You can get by sharing saliva. So that it is not automatically even shared by sexual contact. And one has to be very careful, because if when you vaccinate a person who is already HPV infected and you did not know because you didn't check, that individual, you put them at greater risk of getting harmed, even of getting the cancer later. Something to do with the way the vaccine ingredient interacts with the individual who is already infected. Furthermore, there have been cases of persons who were not infected at all with HPV, and after taking the vaccine, they became infected with the same strain of HPV that you claimed you were vaccinating them against. Case in point, Erin Crawford. She told her story to Truth About Cancer program, Tyler Bollinger and others, and they broadcasted it in their series. Let's continue. So the strongest form of evidence, the RCTs, the randomized control trials, cannot support the sweeping public claims, which is why Cochrane turned to something else. Subheading, the 80% reduction claim rests on biased data. The boldest conclusions came from Cochrane's second review, which analyzed population-level registry data from England, Denmark, and Sweden. These datasets reported an apparent 80% reduction in cervical cancer among girls vaccinated at or before the age of 16 and followed into their early 20s, end quote. Already you should see the problem there. They're vaccinated at about age 16, followed into their early 20s. That's not enough time for you to determine if the vaccine at age 16 cause them to not have cancer because they're not going to have cervical cancer until sometime down the road at age 50. And we're not talking about the exceptions to the rule, you know. Yeah, that a young lady may get it at 35 or something. It's not usually the case. It's usually way down, age 50 and so on. Let's continue. But this is where the claims unravel. Cervical cancer in young women is extremely rare. So even in very large cohorts, the absolute number of cases is small. In some of the key studies, the number of cancers in the vaccinated age groups was in single digits, meaning that tiny absolute differences can inflate into dramatic relative risk reductions. So you have a rarity. It's rare to find cervical cancer in young women. So even if you take a whole big group of women and you study them, the number of cases of cancer would be very small. And we're told that in some of the key studies, the number of cancers in the vaccinated age groups was in the single digits. So 1, 5, 6, 2. And we're also told it means that tiny absolute differences can inflate into dramatic relative risk reductions. So what? In the first place, you choose a very young population that will hardly have cervical cancer among them. You vaccinate them age 16 with the HPV vaccine. But already that young population will not have much cancer. They might have 1, 2. If it's a bigger group of them, it will look like it is even more successful because then the figure of the actual number of cancers would be so minimal. Because if I tell you 5 out of 15 had cancers, that still looks worse than if I tell you 5 out of 500. The 5 out of 500 makes it look as if it's more successful to have the vaccine because then only 5 cases of cervical cancer. But then remember, the 500 were 16-year-olds and they wouldn't normally get cervical cancer until 50. The number of cancers among them is very rare. So that's what you're actually seeing there, and not that the vaccine had worked. But it is inflated into dramatic relative risk reductions. This is how you have to understand what is being said here, my dear people. I continue. More importantly, these data have structural confounders. Differences between vaccinated and unvaccinated girls that are difficult to fully adjust for, even with sophisticated models. For example, so they're going to show you some of the differences. For example, girls vaccinated earliest tend to be from more advantaged families, smoke less, perform better at school, and are more likely to attend screening. Pay attention to that part. Are more likely to attend screening. They're also more healthy. Behaviors that all reduce cancer risk independently of vaccination. Are you seeing the trick building here? Are you seeing it? Let me read that again. For example, girls vaccinated earliest tend to be from more advantaged families, smoke less, perform better at school, and are more likely to attend screening. Behaviors that all reduce cancer risk independently of vaccination. This, quote, healthy vaccinee, or the person who takes the vaccine who's otherwise healthy, this healthy vaccinee effect is well documented in vaccine research. Yet Cochrane's headline findings hinge on precisely the age groups where this effect is strongest. So in other words, my dear people, you take the most healthy 16-year-olds, the ones who are eating well, the ones whose immune systems are stronger. Remember what I told you about the immune system being able to clear the HPV infection in 2 years naturally without any need for a vaccine or anything. They're more healthy, they're from more advantaged families, they're eating better, they have better health practices such as not smoking, etc. And they also have the habit of screening, pap smear screening, which helps you to observe any early or helps you to make early observation of precancerous lesions, and you could treat it there and no cancer develops later down. So what's happening here is you're taking the best group of people who are not likely to develop cervical cancer. You give them the vaccine, so they're a healthy vaccinee, and then you turn around and say, oh, you see, our findings show that the vaccine causes a prevention of cervical cancer, which you can't even prove because of the period of time that hasn't been covered. But do you see what's happening? Do you see the deception? Do you see what we're dealing with? Some of the most influential data, I continue the substack, some of the most influential data in this meta-analysis come from England. But England underwent major changes during the study period that directly affect cervical cancer detection, irrespective of vaccination. Screening changes and behavioral shifts. Let's learn of some of the changes England went through that affects cancer detection, regardless of vaccination. Two major under-discussed factors complicate the apparent benefit. One, England changed its cervical screening age. During the years covered by the registry data, England raised the starting age for cervical screening from 20 to 25. This shifted detection of early lesions out of the under 25 age band and into older groups. UK screening audits show exactly this pattern, with more diagnosis clustering just after the new invitation age. So it's only obvious if you shift the starting age for cervical screening, pap smear screening, to 25. Girls are not going to start screening until 25. So if they have precancerous lesions to be discovered, they're not going to be discovered, or rather you're going to have more diagnosis of those after that age, from 25 up, rather than under that age. That is the logical conclusion, or that is what would happen. The article continues. Hence, this shift could account for a substantial part of the decline in early cancers in under 25s. The same pattern Cochrane presents as evidence of a vaccine effect. It's not because of the fact that they took the vaccine why there's a decline in early cancers detection under 25, but it was because you told them, don't screen under 25, start screening from 25 and above. So now you have a situation where you find more lesions 25 and above when they screen, but before they may very well have had the lesions too, but you weren't screening. But you were given the vaccine. So then you will say, well, it's because of the vaccine that we were given why they didn't have lesions, because you weren't screening. It's all a set of tricks. You understand what I'm saying? Continuing, I previously reported, this is the same author, Dr. Demasi, I previously reported that Scotland made the same screening age change and showed the same shift in abnormalities. A reminder of how easily, quote-unquote, real-world HPV data can be shaped by policy changes rather than any true vaccine effect. And I read that article for you before in the previous story. That's why I read it first. The second screening change and behavioral shift, the second factor that complicate the apparent benefit noted here is 2. Sexual behavior changed dramatically after 2008. What does that mean? Teenage conception rates, a reliable indicator of sexual activity and therefore HPV exposure, dropped sharply across the UK during the period studied. Did you hear that? Teenage conception rates dropped sharply across the UK during the period studied. With fewer early sexual encounters came fewer early HPV exposures, lowering the baseline risk of cervical cancer decades later. Together, these two forces, shifted screening practices and collapsing rates of teenage sexual activity, are powerful enough to reshape national cervical cancer trends. So instead of praising the vaccine for having lowered the cancer rates, they didn't take into consideration that there was also some kind of change of behavior in that study period where you had less teenagers engaging in sexual encounters, and therefore less or fewer exposures to HPV. Notwithstanding the fact that sexual encounter is not the only way a person could be exposed to HPV, but it certainly is one of the ways that exposes them in one of the significant ways. We continue. So again, I need you to notice it's just lies, it's just deceptions, it's just you overlook things that you know you should take into consideration, which would show other natural causes for the lowering of cases of cancer. Because you're not interested in recognizing those causes, you're interested in one thing, pushing the lie that it was the vaccine that caused the prevention of the cervical cancer. Final paragraph under that section says, they coincide precisely, that is, these shifting screening practices and collapsing rates of teenage sexual activity, they coincide precisely with the cohorts used to produce Cochrane's quote-unquote 80% reduction. Yet the review presents the decline as a vaccine effect without adjusting for these potential confounders. Subheading, safety concerns overlooked. Let's read about safety concerns overlooked. The HPV vaccine trials were never designed to give a complete picture of long-term harms, yet the reviews suggest that there are no serious safety concerns. Most trials did not use a true placebo. Instead of comparing the vaccine with saline, the scientific standard, the quote-unquote placebo groups received aluminum adjuvants. Y'all remember that? They give them injected aluminum. The placebo groups received aluminum adjuvants. These substances can trigger side effects themselves, narrowing the visible gap between groups and making the vaccine appear safer than it is. Follow-up was brief. In many trials, adverse events were monitored for only 14 days after each dose. However, conditions that develop more slowly, especially autonomic or neurological disorders, may fall outside that narrow window. So you see again the deception. You cannot just follow people for 14 days. There are many conditions they can develop outside of that 14 days, way after 14 days, but you would never capture them in a study that tells you only monitor them for 14 days. And then you would conclude the vaccine is safe because we monitored for 14 days and we did not find anything. That is wickedness. That is lies. We're continuing. A 2020 analysis by Hodgensen and colleagues, based on thousands of pages of clinical study reports submitted to regulators, found higher rates of serious adverse events than journal articles disclosed, including increased serious nervous system disorders. Take note of this because we're not in 2014 anymore when we first dealt with these things as a church. We're not in 2017 anymore when I pushed back hard in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We're talking about a 2020 analysis. This is just 5 years ago. And we're told in this analysis by Jorgensen and colleagues, they studied thousands of pages of clinical study reports, which were submitted to regulators. So think of the FDA and the CDC and other regulators in different countries. And they found that there were higher rates of serious adverse events from the Gardasil and Cervarix, the HPV vaccines, than medical journal articles were disclosing. And there were higher rates of damage, especially in the area of increased serious nervous system disorders. This is what they're doing to your 12 and your 13-year-old girls and boys, your 16-year-old girls and boys. And there's a photo there of one of those reports, Benefits and Harms of the Human Papilloma HPV Vaccines, systematic review with meta-analyses of trial data from clinical study reports. We're coming to an end here. We're told over the past year, I have been reporting on the Gardasil trial documents. Now, this is the doctor speaking here in 2025, and December 1st. And she says, over the past year, so we're talking December 2024 and earlier, I have been reporting on the Gardasil trial documents released through Robbie versus Merck. That's a case. These documents show, a court case that is, these documents show how clinical trial designs that use active comparators, comparators, short observation windows, and fragmented coding systems can mask safety signals, especially slow onset neurological harms. These things are being revealed in court, my dear people. When governments are making policy, they have to take these things into consideration. But this has not been the case in our land. As evidenced by the videos I show you from the Ministry of Health recently in the previous administration, pushing this vaccine on our people still. When court documents in cases, because people are suing the company Merck who makes the Gardasil HPV vaccination, and it is coming out in court in trial documents that these people have been practicing fraud to hide the damage of the vaccine. They also reveal, that's the court documents, they also reveal that the manufacturer was fully aware of an undisclosed impurity in the vaccine, an additional adjuvant that was never disclosed to recipients and did not have regulatory approval. And this, she points to one of the articles she had done back in February of this year called Court Documents Reveal, quote-unquote, undisclosed adjuvant in Gardasil vaccine. Merck's Gardasil vaccine contains an unapproved immune booster kept secret from the public. A lawsuit is exposing the cover-up. My dear people, these things are what we enthusiasts SDA Church are bringing to you because we follow these things. I have these contacts and emails and updates on these issues through these doctors and these researchers because we love the truth. We want you to know the truth. We don't want you to be deceived into putting poison into your bodies, which are the temples of God. Subheading, what the evidence actually supports. So let's see what the evidence actually supports. When the noise is stripped away, the picture becomes clear. 1. No randomized trial has shown that the HPV vaccine prevents cervical cancer. The trials were simply not designed or powered to answer that question. 2. The quote-unquote 80% reduction comes from small absolute numbers, heavily confounded observational cohorts, disproportionately driven by England's data at a time when screening policy and sexual behavior were changing dramatically. And number 3, the gold standard trials were not designed to look at long-term harms, and independent analyses of clinical study reports have raised unresolved safety questions, including exploratory signals for serious nervous system disorders. That's why we had videos of girls in Colombia and different places dropping down and shaking and having different problems. And then the doctors would tell them, it's all in your head. It's all in your head. It was nervous system problems. Continuing, Cochrane's public messaging overstated effectiveness, understated uncertainty, and presented biased observational findings as settled science. For an organization with global influence and a reputation built on methodological rigor, the gap between its data and its public positioning is very concerning. The HPV vaccine is a major public health intervention. People deserve accurate information, not amplified certainty built on narrow and confounded data. Cochrane was meant to be the organization that guarded against this kind of overreach, but evidently it failed. So they have made it, this is my opinion here, they have made it a major public health intervention. But the truth is, the HPV vaccine is not for public health. It's totally and wholly unnecessary to deal with HPV and to deal with cervical cancer because it can't. There's no proof anyway that it deals with cervical cancer or stops cervical cancer. But instead, it has been presented as a major public health intervention based all on lies, as we have shown you in these two substacks. And we want to thank very much Dr. Demasi, Dr. Maryanna Demasi, PhD. I'm a paid subscriber to her substacks, and she presents all this very good information so that persons do not have to be deceived. We thank you for listening. We pray that you would take heed and do not be deceived. Don't let your children take this vaccine. HPV, whether it's Gardasil, Gardasil 9, Cervarix, any other brand they bring out, don't let them take it. You don't take it either, because they're offering it to young women as well in their 20s, 30s, older women, they're offering it to. Don't take it. It is not based on truth that it will stop you from getting cervical cancer. And furthermore, it is going to increase your risk of problems in your health, including serious neurological disorders. And you don't want that. Take care of yourselves. Eat healthy as much as it's possible. One of the best diets is a vegan health reform diet where you stay away from flesh foods and you eat more natural foods, your fruits, your vegetables, your legumes, natural things as far as is possible with the help of God. You get your exercise, your fresh air, your sunlight, rest and so on, and you will be all water, and you will have a better than not functioning immune system that could help you deal with any HPV infection as it may come. May God bless you. I'm Sister Anissa Baptiste for Thusia Seventh-day Adventist Church. Amen.